We wondered, perhaps we hoped that Fernando Alonso might win at least a drag race down to turn one after the Spaniard had qualified second in the rain on Saturday. But in the end, Max Verstappen made good on his 150th F1 race start and never looks too seriously challenged over the 70 laps of the Gilles Villeneuve circuit on the Ile Notre Dame in Montreal to take his 26th Grand Prix victory. Well, welcome everybody to this time zone friendly edition of the GoF show. Better to have this really, we think, in the evening, at least in Asia, on Monday rather than early hours of the morning. And thank you for joining us, and do join us please with the conversation. You know we're on social media, at GoF1 show is our handle. We've got plenty to discuss about the Grand Prix from Canada, the return of King Lewis to the podium, Fernando Alonso providing some inspiration to the over 40s. But before we dive into that, let's welcome to the show our very own F1 legend. His name is Alex Yoong. He joins us from Kuala Lumpur. Alex, was that worth staying up late at night for?
Yeah, definitely. Slightly unexpected podium, wasn't it, with Sainz taking the fight to Verstappen? That was interesting to see, and nice to see. Nice to see Sainz full of confidence and driving hard. And Hamilton, like you said, back on the podium. How nice was that? And really, we shouldn't be that surprised. You know, there are a couple of tracks which are really Hamilton tracks, and Canada is definitely one of them. You know, he's pretty much untouchable here. So it was really good to see him back on the podium, and looked really quick.
You did indeed. Now, if you've been, ladies and gentlemen, physically at a Grand Prix any time between about 1985 and now, then you will recognize at least the voice of our special guest today. He is Bob Constanduros, and along with other work as a journalist and TV broadcaster, Bob is probably most famous as the podium announcer and circuit commentator for Formula One. He's been doing that now for about 3 decades, about 700 Grand Prix, and a role that he was interviewed for by none other than the Formula One boss, Bernie Ecclestone. Luckily for us, Bob, one of the few races he's not doing this year was the Canadian Grand Prix. So we leapt at the opportunity to ask Bob to join us on the GoF1 show, and he does, from sunny Suffolk. Thank you for joining us, Bob.
Yes, Sussex in south of England. Yes, sunny Sussex. Lovely to be here, Matt. Thanks very much indeed for inviting me.
Fantastic. Well, really, it's great to have you. Now, before we dig too deeply into it, let's look at the results which are brought to us by our friends at Next Level Racing.
Let's be innovative. Let's challenge the norm. Let's raise the bar. Let's be the elite.
And here are the results. And of course, as we said at the top of the show, Max Verstappen it was who won the Grand Prix ahead of Carlos Sainz of Ferrari, who took fastest lap. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell 3rd and 4th for Mercedes, ahead of Charles Leclerc 5th, Esteban Ocon 6th, Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu finished 7th and 8th for Alfa Romeo Sauber. Fernando Alonso was actually 7th on the road after a penalty. He lines up 9th on the standings, and Lance Stroll rounds out the top 10. Now, Alex, if you would, let's run through the highlights, a few bullet points that Miko has put together for us for this Grand Prix that summarises what happened in the 51st Canadian Grand Prix.
Well, like you said, Alonso wasn't quite able to get Verstappen off the line, was he? So Verstappen took an early and quite easy lead over the opening laps. Sainz was able to get past Alonso into second. And then we saw Verstappen stop at the first virtual safety car for Sergio Perez. And then there's another virtual safety car came out for Mike Schumacher. So Sainz stopped then, and then we saw Hamilton overtaking Alonso for P3. Alonso would fade a bit with some engine issues. Verstappen would then stop under green flag conditions, and Sainz stopped under the last safety car, the only safety car, and that put them really together. You know, Verstappen versus Sainz of the last 15 laps after the safety car, and Sainz of course had 5-lap younger tires and really made a good go at trying to overtake Verstappen, but it wasn't to be, and Verstappen held on for his win.
Wasn't to be. So Bob, first of all, question for you. You've probably seen most of Max Verstappen's 25, he's now 26, let's say 25 of the 26 Grand Prix victories. How does this one rank, do you think?
Well, I think he had it a little bit easier here. Or at least it was meant to be a little bit easier, because in theory, he already had his Charles Leclerc, his closest rival, starting at the back after engine penalties. Sergio Perez also starting well back as well, so we didn't have too much challenge from him. Carlos Sainz, is usually the second best of the two Ferrari drivers, so wasn't necessarily going to be up there. So in theory, it was going to be easier for Max Verstappen. But even he admitted it wasn't that easy, and really Carlos Sainz really hooked up with the car extremely well, and Sainz was really on fantastic form and really pushing hard all the way to the checkered flag, as we're well aware. So it wasn't an easy one for Max Verstappen. It was a pretty difficult one, but it certainly kept him on his toes.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that, Matt. I mean, you know, it was really good seeing Sainz there, but you have to say, if it was Leclerc, it would have been a little bit different. You know, we're used to seeing, because what was very key was on the penultimate lap, Sainz out of the last corner got really close to Verstappen, but he made a mistake, took too much curb. And then on the penultimate lap again, still on the hairpin, leading on the back straight, he also ran a little bit wide there. So these are the crucial moments. I'm not saying Sainz could have still overtaken Verstappen, but it's those sort of crucial moments that when we've seen Leclerc and Verstappen fight earlier in the year at Saudi Arabia and at Bahrain, where you could see them following each other very closely in the dirty air and still not be able to make mistakes. And that's when you saw this position swap between them quite a lot. And you just saw Sainz make those crucial, tiny, tiny mistakes, but maybe just allowed Verstappen to have a slightly easier last lap to the line.
I thought Verstappen was flawless in those last 16 laps after the safety car that you mentioned, Sainz behind him on the newer tyres. And I was surprised to see a stat, not only 26 now Grand Prix victories, but that Max has finished in the top two in 1/3 of all the races that he's competed in Formula One. I was kind of surprised by that stat, actually.
Wow. It's impressive, isn't it? You forget how young he is. Remember when he joined Formula One as was he 16 when he joined Formula One, or 17? Just turned 17. And I remember thinking that's way too young. I thought that would end up in disaster. But wow, we've proven wrong, right? He's a bit of a phenomenal driver. I mean, did everything so young. Obviously took a long time to win his first world championship because of the Mercedes domination. And yeah, sometimes he looks quite unstoppable.
We should mention quickly that Sergio Perez had, after a lovely victory at the Monaco Grand Prix, of course, he had a pretty poor outing, didn't he, Bob, in Montreal, both in qualifying and then in the race?
Yes, exactly. He was started well back on the grid in the race itself and never really made much of an impression before he pulled off with a power unit problem. So we don't know exactly what that was, but he really didn't feature at all in the Canadian Grand Prix, and probably is really looking forward to Silverstone, where he can really get his teeth into it again. So as you say,
absolutely,
after winning in Monaco and Azerbaijan, I can't remember what happened there, but it wasn't great. So he's a couple of races to forget, perhaps.
Yeah, still lies second in the championship. As you say, probably looking forward to getting back on track at Silverstone. Let's talk a little bit about Carlos Sainz, because he qualified third. We're going to get, ladies and gentlemen, later on to the subject of Alex Yoong's former teammate, Fernando Alonso, and his dramatic qualifying performance. But let's talk about the other Spaniard in the race, Carlos Sainz. Started third, finished second, put on a pretty strong challenge. Alex, you've said that you didn't think it was probably ever really going to happen. I wonder whether, Bob, you agreed with that and what your opinion is of Sainz versus Leclerc in terms of talent and speed.
So many times I've actually said what a perfectly matched pair they are, because so often you find them, say, in a practice session or a qualifying session, they literally end up hundredths of a second apart. And yet Leclerc seems to be the slightly more aggressive driver, doesn't make quite so many mistakes as Sainz does. Sainz has had more accidents. He's ended up on the wall. He's damaged the car more often. Don't get me wrong. I'm a great Sainz fan. I love him and his dad as well. Just a great double act together, father and son. But I just don't feel that Carlos has quite got the measure of Leclerc when it comes to races. And also, you see him dropping back just a little bit during the races in comparison to Leclerc. So I thought Sainz was really on form, and I was so delighted to see he was on form this last weekend. But he's perhaps not quite as aggressive, maybe doesn't quite have the confidence yet that Charles Leclerc has. So I still am waiting to see the best of Carlos Sainz. It's to come. Sure, it's to come.
Yes, I know what you mean. And the stats on that are pretty clear, aren't they? In qualifying this year, he's 8 times been out-qualified by Charles Leclerc, and the one time he did start ahead of him on the grid was this time in Canada, when, of course, Charles had penalties for power unit changes, still lies, well, he only lies fifth in the World Championship and some 24 points off Charles, who is third. We've got a question in from the audience. We did ask for them, and we are getting them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And here it is. And the question is, I think this is to Alex, really, the question is that if Ferrari had put Carlos Sainz onto medium tyres, would there have been any chance, do you think, of him catching and indeed overtaking Max Verstappen?
Yeah, that's a really valid question. It would have been the aggressive choice for sure. I think Ferrari tried to play it a bit safe because they knew Sainz suffered from graining on that first stint in mediums at the very beginning of the race. But normally when you have a little bit of graining on a green track, that can go away once the track's gripped up. And especially towards the end of the race, it would have been low fuel. It would have been a fair shout to put him on mediums. There was only, 15 laps of really hard laps to go. And it would have been a decent shout, I think. But I think maybe Ferrari felt the graining was so bad at the beginning of the race that the graining would still be an issue at the end of the race. And so they decided the hard tire was a safer option. And maybe they thought he could have done it on the hard tire, because it's 5 laps younger. Canada is a track you can overtake. And just to reiterate what Bob was saying, it is, Sainz is going to win Grand Prix. He'll win lots of races in his career, but he doesn't quite show that sparkle that says to me this guy's going to win a world championship one day. Not like Leclerc and Verstappen do, and that's what I would say. I mean, Sainz was faultless in that drive towards Verstappen, but just a small mistake, using too much curb in the last corner with 2 laps to go, and then just running wide at the hairpin. Because at that point he was within 4/10 of Verstappen, so you thought, all right, he's definitely. I'm not saying he's going to overtake, but he'll definitely be able to get. If he nailed those 2 corners, he would have been on the penultimate lap, close enough to Verstappen that Verstappen would have at least had to defend. And if he had to defend, maybe Sainz has a chance to try and overtake. Not saying he would have made the move, but he didn't really get Verstappen to defend, which meant that just at those key moments, he wasn't quite good enough.
Yeah, totally. That's the key point, isn't it? It never looked like Max was actually anywhere other on the racetrack than he would have been if he was running alone. So the person who was on the racetrack in an unusual position, certainly this year, Lewis Hamilton on the podium, started from 4th, which was his best qualifying position of the year. Difficult to believe I'm saying that out loud. 2nd podium of the year. I'm going to be controversial here, Bob, and say that the only reason that Lewis Hamilton actually was really as happy as he looked was that he both qualified and finished the race ahead of his teammate, and finished the race ahead of his teammate for the first time since, I think, the opening round in Bahrain. Do you think I'm right about that? You know Lewis better than most.
I think he was a lot happier with the car. The car on the Friday had a lot of experimental stuff on it. They went a funny direction in terms of experiments, in terms of setup, that sort of thing. And then, obviously, the wet qualifying, the wet Saturday was a bit of a wild card. And all of a sudden, they put together a really much better car for Lewis on Sunday. And he found himself in a car that he could really race. And I think that was the difference. The car was just a completely different being to what it had been on Friday, was so much better. He really felt he had something that resembled what he's been used to in the past couple of seasons, past few years, for the first time. And I think that's what really made the difference for him. Sure, he was happy that he'd beaten his teammate. Sure, he was happy to be on the podium. But I think he was also very happy to have the car he wanted.
Of course, we mustn't forget he was flattered, or Mercedes were flattered, weren't they, by the fact that Red Bull and Ferrari kindly removed one each of their cars from the competition through power unit issues and the subsequent grid penalty for Ferrari and Leclerc and Sergio Perez's gearbox failure we talked about earlier. Alex, what did you think about Lewis and actually about, of course, George Russell as well?
I thought he had another strong race, to be honest. Okay, it wasn't, especially in the closing stages, it wasn't quite as quick as Hamilton. Hamilton pulled out a gap just after the safety car, but it's Lewis Hamilton at Canada. I think he's won Canada 7 times. It's a crazy amount of times. He won his first race there. Hamilton's pretty much untouchable. There are a few tracks that Hamilton's untouchable at. He's won at all the tracks, but a few tracks he's untouchable at. One is Canada, one's America. And pretty much 90% of the time also in Hungary, So I really thought that he would be strong this weekend. But back to Russell. Yeah, Russell in the very beginning, so strong. Those opening laps, he chose his moments well. He overtook really well. So to get onto the back of Hamilton, I thought he was very impressive. This young man is continuing to impress me. This man shows that special something that tells me that one day he could be a world champion. And it's exciting to watch. And he's pushing Hamilton like mad. And Hamilton, I think, is starting to realize that, wow, he's going to really have to bring his A game if he's going to compete with his younger teammate.
We should mention, Bob, shouldn't we, that George Russell, 24 years of age, decided in qualifying in Q3, final run, to put on slick tyres, despite a massive kind of swimming pool puddle at turn 1. What did you think when you saw that?
Brave, perhaps, or foolhardy, somewhere between the two, very close. Yeah, I was a bit worried about that. I think I was inevitably going to be worried about it. It was a gamble, Drivers are like that, I think. Alex, wouldn't you say so? You must have done a few things like that in your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely it was a gamble. I mean, no one else thought about doing it, but I think, Russell, you could tell but that's another thing about Russell. He's impatient to show that he's a champion in the making, isn't he? It won't be enough that he's just beating what is arguably the greatest driver of all time in Formula One's history. That's not going to be enough. No, he wants to win races. He wants to win championships, and he thinks he deserves it. So yeah, in the end it was foolhardy, but if it paid off, wow, he'd be looking like a hero.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm enjoying the fact that when they talk, both Lewis now, but certainly George since the start of the year, always making reference to his performance relative to his teammate, because he knows that's the bar that we all respect so much. And speaking of that, let's do our own version of that, which is our GoF1 show performance chart, where we compare the starting positions and finishing positions. It's only one metric, of course, ladies and gentlemen, but one of the things we can see there is, first of all, Fernando Alonso dropping down. He's the only person in red in the top 10, lost 7 places from his starting position. But the two people outstanding, unsurprisingly, Charles Leclerc, having started 19th, gained 14 points. And the other person we're going to talk about a little bit is Lance Stroll. Let's talk about Charles Leclerc first. Alex started 19th. Finished 5th, but he did lose 15 points to Verstappen. What did you think about his performance on the weekend for him?
Yeah, good performance, but I expect nothing less from Leclerc. I expect him to come from the back to go to the top 5. I was surprised by the performance of the Ferrari. One of the big strengths about the Ferrari has been its traction out of slow corners. And you could hear in the race that Leclerc was complaining about the diff or something. Maybe that was affecting his traction out of the slow corners. But Sainz also didn't look brilliant out of the slow corners. And that's been a Ferrari strength this year. That's why they dominated Australia. And that's why, other tracks like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Sector 1, they've been so good. But I was mystified at why they looked so poor out of the slow corners, especially when Leclerc was trying to overtake Bottas. Bottas looked really good out of the slow corners. And, he's got a Ferrari power unit. So we know that that's where the Ferrari is really good, at the bottom end. But, I was a bit surprised. I wonder, I'm not 100% sure Ferrari might have got the setup right on the day. Here he is talking about how frustrating it was. They were very much focusing on straight line speed, trying to cut that straight line speed deficit to Red Bull, and I think they made progress on that. But they must remember that they have got strengths that work really well, and one of them is that slow speed traction, bottom end power of that power unit. Didn't seem to have it on the day.
I was surprised, Bob, that they went with what I'd call a kind of defensive strategy in a way, starting on the hard tyre, which kind of locked them into having to go long, didn't it? Obviously, starting on the hard tyre, because they only need, in a race that was possibly 1 and maybe 2 stops. Did you think the same thing? Were you surprised they didn't go more aggressive with him, stick him on mediums at the start, or even softs?
Yeah, nobody went softs at all, did they? And Mario Isola said the reason for that was because it was still a green track after the rain from the previous day, and it really wasn't worth risking the soft compound tyre. So everyone went either medium or hards, and everyone, the strategy initially was a one-stop strategy. Of course, then there were the 2 virtual safety cars and the safety car at the end as well. So that sort of changed the whole strategy anyway. But I think you're right. Perhaps a medium would have been a more logical choice right at the start. But as you say, they went on the hard compound. And of course, the track changed. As Alex was saying, it was going to grip up inevitably because of it was so green to begin with, having rained the previous day. so much. So it's inevitably going to get more grip. But yeah, strategy does perhaps seem to be a little bit the weak point at the moment when it comes to Ferrari. And we've seen for the last couple of Grand Prix, we've seen that.
Well, the past couple of decades, probably, other than the Schumacher years. But anyway, I shouldn't. But I say that because he started on the hards, and of course he was locked into going long, and he got stuck in a DRS train, and then he got stuck behind Ocon, and then he did finally make his pit stop, having kind of got to a point where they thought they could drop him back into some clear air, and then they managed to fumble the pit stop. And of course, not only does that, but it was frustrating watching it and to be the driver in the car, and then he came out back behind in traffic again. So he put a good face on it. But the reason we're talking about Leclerc so much is that, of course, he's the person we consider to be the key championship challenger to Red Bull's Max Verstappen. We've put together a couple of things to show you, ladies and gentlemen. One is a chart, because his season looked so strong. Let's take a look at it. His season looked so strong, where he had a win, a second place, and a win. Let's start off actually with the chart first of all, which shows the results of the first 9 races. This is it here. There you go. You can see that Leclerc second, first, with fastest laps when he won the Grand Prix, and Max DNF'd in those 2. And as you can see, then basically Max has gone on to win 5 of the following 6 races and ended up with 175 points over Charles' 126. Now let's look at the graph, which I know is an Alex Yoong strong point. So Alex, you can talk about this nice graph here.
Yeah, and you have to say it's Ferrari dropping the ball. I mean, I did say at the beginning of the season that if we go by what Ferrari's weaknesses, they tend to make mistakes about halfway through the season or 3/5 of the way through the season. It seems to be happening even earlier this time. Okay, yes, the reliability issues, the engines letting go was a shame, but I don't really want to focus too much on the engine because Red Bull also lost 2 engines, so that's just part and parcel of the motorsport. Sometimes through the season you have these reliability issues, but it's more the operational mistakes that we worry about. The fumbled pit stops, going for the wrong strategy, and we've talked about this before, that the pressure in Ferrari is such that everything gets analyzed, that it's people tend to start fearing about making mistakes then instead of making the right decisions, and it's really hard to get that flow just right. And it's something Schumacher and Ross Brawn and Rory Bryan and Nigel Steffney also talked about in the Ferrari years. John Todd's chief role was protecting them from that pressure. And you have to say in the Schumacher years, when they won 5 world titles on the trot, and even when the car wasn't the fastest, they would always get the strategy right. That was a special period, and that period you'd say carried on to even Kimi Räikkönen, winning his world championship a few years after that. But it seems to have got back to the old stage where there's a lot of pressure, and the operationally they're not as sound as the other teams. Obviously, the team still has a lot of talent. They're building great cars, so they obviously got some talent in the factory, making these designs and building the cars. But at the track, I think we need someone there to protect them so that they have the freedom to push for the right mistake instead of worrying about the wrong mistake.
Well, so 54 points was Charles' advantage at the Australian Grand Prix. Is 49 points behind now at round 9. Bob, can you put your finger on what's the problem?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I think Alex is absolutely right. The pressure in Italy, everyone knows about this pressure that Ferrari have from the Italian media, from everybody else. It's a national team. The media in Italy is huge. And you just all the time, they will be worrying about getting it wrong and not, as you say, getting it right, working on getting it right. I think it's absolutely a very valid way of looking at it. And so they've really got to have the confidence to go for it and to get everything correct, all the ducks in a row, as it were, and to get everything right. They've got, obviously, they had the fastest car in Montreal, that's for sure, even though it was only maybe 3-4 tenths quicker, which wasn't enough for Sainz to get past Verstappen. But they have got the fastest car. They did have the fastest car there. Whether they will in the more conventional tracks coming up the next 4 circuits before the summer break, that'll be interesting to see. And that's something they've really got to work on to hit the ground running at the first of these next 2 double headers. We've got 2 double headers coming up. the other side of the summer break, we've got a triple header before they go off to Japan, Singapore and Japan. So it's really, really tough at the moment for all the teams. It's not just Ferrari, but it'll be very interesting to see what they can do when we start the more conventional circuits coming up.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we highlighted two people in the race performance chart. One, obviously, Charles Leclerc, because he made up 14 positions. And the other was Lance Stroll, who made up 7, got himself into the points. But I'm impressed here because my contention is 4th consecutive time he's been knocked out in Q1, out-qualified his teammate only in Miami, has 10 less points than Sebastian Vettel, despite Sebastian not doing the first 2 Grand Prix. I just feel that this is kind of almost the worst season that I've seen from Lance Stroll. I wondered, Alex, whether you think he's losing interest. Is it? I just don't get it, really.
Yeah, well, let's not forget, he's still a really good driver. Huh? When he won that F3 championship, he was amazing. He has got a pole position, which is one more than either of us. You know, he's finished on the podium a few times, so he is a good driver. Is he good enough to be to warrant that place after so many years in being in Formula One? You could argue probably not. You know, but you have to say his performance today was quite strong, huh? You know, his pace on the old tires, he went for the hard strategy in the very beginning, the hard tire. And you saw Bottas, I think it was Bottas, and then Zhou came up against him, and they just couldn't get past him. And this was when the tire was very worn. And I was very surprised by this. And somehow Stroll had done such a good job in the first half of the race that even when the tire was worn, he still had enough there that he could stay in front of the Alfa Romeos. And that was really impressive. So he has not had a good year, but today, yesterday, he had a really strong race.
Fair enough. Would you agree with that, Bob?
Yeah, 3 10th places he's had this year. So he's got 3 World Championship points. And as you say, not the greatest season, but it hasn't been the greatest season for Sebastian Vettel either. It hasn't been the greatest season for the team, full stop. It hasn't been easy for them. They've got, of course, the modifications that came in Barcelona, I think, and they're still getting on top of those modifications. They still really haven't tested that much, those modifications, that big upgrade that came in Barcelona. So they're still working on that, and I think Vettel is doing the same thing. So I think it's a little bit different. I know everyone looks on Stroll as being this, the rich kid who's only there because Daddy has bought the company. There's a little bit of that, but as Alex was saying, he did win the Formula 3 championship, and that's not an easy thing to do. So he did certainly deserve his place in the team at that time. Whether he still does is beginning to be questioned, just as you did question there, Matthew.
Yeah, I did. And if we look at the Constructors' Championship, we'll see that Aston Martin, in a car that looks pretty much like the Red Bull, has to be said, only 8th in the standings there with 16 points. So Red Bull, of course, leading comfortably now. They've got 82 wins in Formula One. They've put some 76 points ahead of Ferrari. Actually, Ferrari, of course, closed in a little bit this weekend because they had 2 cars finishing to Red Bull's only 1. And we're kind of starting to see now, aren't we, a gap between the top 3 and the rest. McLaren 4th in the Constructors, but very poor results here. Daniel Ricciardo finishing 11th, Norris 15th. No points, of course, for them. Alpine are closing in, they're 5th, and so are Alfa Romeo, P6. Let's talk about the Alfa Romeo team in particular. Let's talk about Zhou Guanyu, the Chinese driver from Shanghai, to 9th on the road, gifted 8th by our friend Fernando Alonso, who got a penalty at the end. And as you said, actually, and talking about Lance Stroll's strong performance in the race, he managed to fend off Lance Stroll. I thought it was a very strong performance from Zhou, actually, 23-year-old. What did you think, Alex?
Yeah, I think so. I thought he was strong in Baku as well. So that's, I think, yeah, he was Baku. Baku, he was strong, wasn't he? Out-qualified Bottas. Okay, I don't think he finished the race, but you're seeing some strong performances from Zhou. He's looking a bit more competitive. You know, we talked about it at the beginning of the year. I think about 3 races in, we said about how he's had a really steady start. Nothing spectacular, but steady. I'm not making silly accidents like Tsunoda. to name one person who also made another silly accident on Sunday. But we said he had to build at some point. At some point, he had to get quicker, and he had to out-qualify his teammate and outrace his teammate. And the last two races, we suddenly started to see signs that, ooh, a bit more pace here, ooh, looking a bit stronger. So if he can build on that and go on a run, especially during the summer, and build on that and beat his teammate a few more times, then we're going to start really getting excited about him.
Yeah, absolutely. He's only got 5 points, of course, in the Drivers' Championship. His teammate Valtteri Bottas has got 46. But to your point, Joe's had, before this race, 3 out of 4 races he had a mechanical DNF. So it's quite an important point to remember. Bob?
And another point is that, of course, he didn't know the circuit and lost a whole day with the wet. So that was an entirely new circuit for him. Yeah. So I think he did a really good job, and I was pleased to see him gifted that extra point, extra place. Valtteri just is, he's fantastically reliable. He's sorting out the car. He's doing a good job for that, I think. But he doesn't have that sparkle. The same thing, say with Carlos. But you can absolutely rely on him to get some points. And he's got a lot of points in the championship, has Bottas, 46 points there in the championship. And that is really good. And he's just stacking them up, just keeps on getting them, keeps on getting them. But for how long was he stuck behind? Was it Stroll? He was stuck behind him for so long. You know, if it was Leclerc, you could actually see Leclerc just scything his way through them. But Bottas was stuck with the same power unit. That's the only thing about Valtteri. I mean, I really like Valtteri. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now it's time for a quick break, and we've been mentioning we're going to talk about Fernando Alonso. We are going to talk about him, of course. Last time out in Azerbaijan, he set a new record for the longest duration of racing career, 7,771 days it was at Azerbaijan. In Montreal, he showed he's still a force to be reckoned with, at least in qualifying, where he qualified second. Anyway, before we get on to that, here's a word from our collaboration partners at WebEx.
Late breaking. What do you think?
Love it or no chance?
Daniel, no chance.
Let's put up a poll.
Love it, love it, love it wins.
We need that part.
It's nearly done.
Can you repeat that? That's better.
It's done.
With WebEx, the McLaren Formula One team is collaborating like never before. Introducing the WebEx Suite, driving hybrid work.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the GoF1 show with myself, Matthew Marsh, our special guest, Bob Constanduros, and our own F1 legend, Alex Yoong. Reminder of the results from the Canadian Grand Prix, of course, round 9 of this year's World Championship. Max Verstappen won for Red Bull from Ferrari's Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton from Mercedes. And Max Verstappen now leads the World Drivers' Championship by 46 points from his teammate Sergio Perez and 49 points from Ferrari's Charles Leclerc, who finished 5th in the Canadian Grand Prix from 19th on the grid. Remember, you can, of course, communicate with us using our social media handle at GoF1 Show. And here is a question that's come in from a member of our audience, John the Storyteller. And he's asking about Mick Schumacher. Was this Mick's, the Canadian Grand Prix, was it Mick's one chance to show what he's truly capable of? Well, he qualified 6th, didn't he, Bob? I think this season Baku is the only time he's been eliminated in Q1, but unfortunately Mick didn't have much luck in the race, retired on lap 19 with a mechanical failure whilst running 7th.
Well, of course, for Haas, it was such a sad race, really, with Magnussen, first of all, getting caught up with Hamilton on the first lap and having to come in for a change of nose section. Mick was there. He hung on in there for a few laps. He was doing well. And then, of course, he had to retire with power unit problem. Really unfortunate for Mick. Magnussen carried on, but was way at the back, never really recovered at all. So was it Mick's only chance? It was a chance. Let's hope there's other chances. But Mick, of course, he is a little bit on notice, if you like, having had a few accidents and cost the team a lot of money. It was good to see that Gene Haas was there. One wonders if he had waited until the end of qualifying before he got in the plane. I don't know if he was there before, but after qualifying, what a fantastic performance. Great to see both of the drivers in there and putting together such good performances, particularly for Mick as well. That was important for him. Was it his only chance? As I say, we've got loads more races. We are only at race 9, remember, in the championship. 22 races in total, another 13 to go. And the other point, incidentally, which you might like to come to, we're already taking engine penalties. We're only at race 9.
That is a very good point, isn't it? And I've often thought that this engine formula, I heard Toto, who was it saying that the engines cost, the incremental cost is about $1 million per unit, which sounds like a lot of money if you had to buy one at home. But if you're a Formula One racing team spending 100 and something million, I would have thought that having a couple more of those per season would just make things a bit easier, wouldn't it, to go racing?
Yeah, agreed.
Alex is not convinced. Oh, Alex doesn't. Yeah. What I want to get your opinion on, Alex, is Kevin Magnussen, because as Bob said, 5th and 6th in qualifying for the Haas team was fantastic, and set them up for some really important point scoring, money making, finishing positions in the race. And I thought I just thought it was, I don't know what to say, really disappointing.
Yeah, Kevin's, we always, part of the reason we like Kevin Magnussen is because he's a real charger, and he attacked Hamilton, but unfortunately got a bit unlucky. It was a really small touch with Hamilton, unfortunately that it broke his front wing a bit. Stewart said it was a bit dangerous, so he had to come in and change the nose. So a shame for that. But, I've been thinking about this recently, because Magnussen looked so good at the beginning of the year. Haas looked so good at the beginning of the year. And I think Magnussen looked even better because he was so much better than his teammate. But for me, Mick Schumacher is still an unknown quantity at this level. So the question really is, was Magnussen really that good? Or is that good? Or was the Haas just such a good car at the beginning of the year? And now we're getting into the middle of the part of the year and all the teams are getting on top of the porpoising and getting on top of the regulations. Because don't forget, Haas did zero work on their car last year. From the beginning of last year, they started working on this year's car. So they committed to this year's car way earlier than anyone else. So it's not a surprise to see him strong in the beginning of the year. So I don't really have an answer for you on this, Matt, because I'm not sure which it is. Whether, Magnussen really is that great, or he was just flattered because Haas had the jump on everyone at the beginning of the year.
And my point was that I thought he just doesn't know when to give up the position. And fighting Lewis on lap 1 in Barcelona and the same thing here, both times threw away good results. Haas only 9th in the Constructors' Championship. We saw that. Let's look now at the Drivers' Championship standings, because we'll see that poor Mick Schumacher yet to score a point. We won't see, in fact. He's down in 19th, and we won't see Kevin Magnussen either, because he's down in 12th. There is Max Verstappen, 46 points ahead of Sergio Perez, 49 ahead of Charles Leclerc. 4th is George Russell. He's only actually 18 points off P2, Sergio Perez. Only one McLaren in the top 10 at the moment. That's Lando Norris, of course. One Alfa Romeo, Valtteri Bottas. And the 2 Alpines now are there. Esteban Ocon 9th, and Fernando Alonso, the only person to actually move up a place in the top 10 this weekend after finishing 9th in Montreal. Let's talk about Fernando Alonso, Alex Yoong's teammate back in 2001. Interesting weekend for him, Alex.
Yeah. Gosh, that sounds like such a long time ago. In some ways, it feels like yesterday. Thanks, mate. I said it in the last show. I'm not a fan of old drivers hanging around and taking spots of new drivers, hard charges. But Alonso is still great to watch. He's still so exciting. He's, is he as good as he still has that intensity. He's if we ignored his age and who he was completely, and we just took his results and his performances here, I'd be thinking I'm looking at a young driver. I'd be thinking I'm looking at a young driver who's just attacking the car so much, not getting the results. His teammate Ocon is leading him in the championship, has picked up the points. But whenever you see him on the top, sometimes on a Friday, first practice on a dirty track, he's at the top of the timesheets, or so he's second, or when it's wet in qualifying Canada, he's suddenly second in an Alpine. You see this sort of performances, you think, wow, this is the sort of performances of a young charger coming up. but then you realize, oh no, it's Fernando Alonso, and he's still great to watch. You know, you get the sense when he drives that he's not interested in finishing 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th. You know, he really would like to still try and win races. You often see him doing counter strategies, attacking when he shouldn't, and sometimes that's why he gets, you know, these issues. Australia, when he was in the hunt for pole position, perhaps, okay, something went wrong with the car, but he crashed the car in qualifying, you know. So he had a small issue with the car, and perhaps that led to the crash. Perhaps he was over pushing, you know. So he's not getting the results this year. He's behind his teammates, but gosh, I can't stop watching him. He's really exciting to watch. And I hope he stays in Formula One. He's got a few more years left in him, I think.
Do you agree, Bob? And also tell us about his
Yeah.
teammate. Yeah.
Well, his peers absolutely agree. You know, you listening to Jenson Button talking about him, for example, at the weekend. Absolutely, they thoroughly agree with Alex. He's a young guy who's still throwing the car into the corners, really having a go every single time. And I think that's the great thing about Fernando. He's 40 years old. You know, Lewis Hamilton's beginning to think, am I going to go on for another 5-6 years? You know, like Fernando, and how much further can Fernando go? You know, he's a fantastic guy. Fantastic guy. And Esteban Ocon, I'm absolutely certain, is learning loads from him. And Ocon is an interesting driver, interesting guy. Certainly a very capable man as well. I think they're a good pair, actually, good couple of drivers. And you can rely on them when they've got the right machinery and they're good at sorting out that machinery as well. I think they'll be more regular front runners. Remember, nobody else uses the Renault engine or Alpine engine, whichever you like to call it. So they're a little bit out on a limb. Perhaps they'd like to share it with somebody else. And an interesting point, their third driver, Oscar Piastri, Otmar Zafnauer said at the weekend that Oscar Piastri will be racing in Formula One next year. Surely not with Alpine. Surely they're going to carry on with those two drivers. So he's going to pop up somewhere else.
And come on then, Bob, you've laid down the scent for that one. You put down a bit of cheese for the mouse to run after. So where's Oscar Piastri going to be driving in 2023?
Well, the rumors are Williams. That's what the rumors are at the moment.
But we don't want rumors. We've got Bob Constanduros on the show, so we get the facts. That's the whole point of having you here.
Take it as a fact.
You're giving me some rope, are you?
Yes, exactly.
He's giving me some rope. That's what he's doing, Alex.
Exactly.
I'm sure you know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, happens a lot, doesn't it?
Speaking of rope, thank you for that segue there, Bob. The FIA issued a technical directive in the week leading up to the Grand Prix, explaining that the measures that they aimed to introduce, it turned out, to tackle the problem of porpoising. And unsurprisingly, Mercedes Toto Wolff, unsurprisingly because the Mercedes is the one that's been so affected performance-wise, was pretty impressed and happy. And less impressed, we might say, was Christian Horner, because of course the Red Bull cars seem to be doing rather well. And at the end of the weekend, Mattia Binotto of Ferrari has said, well, anyway, the technical directive isn't supposed to be a change of regulations, only a clarification, and so on and so forth. Luckily, we've got Alex Yoong here to talk to us about what on earth they are talking about.
I have no idea. No. I think they've just issued a directive that they are going to look into it. So first of all, they recognize, by saying that, they're recognizing that the porpoising is a safety issue, because they wouldn't take this action because they can only do these sort of changes unless they think it's a safety issue, because otherwise you need the agreement of majority of the teams. But first of all, they need to define how much is too much. You know, so they're going to have to go and do some. This is not something. This is not a work of a moment. They're going to study this. They're going to see how much the frequency is, and try and determine what is a safe frequency that is not going to damage your drivers and cause them lasting damage. And once they define that, I think they'll say you must be under that frequency, and maybe they might introduce some technical changes on the floor or something to try and stop it. Maybe stays or something. We don't know yet, but definitely the intention is to try and work on something.
It does feel a little bit unfair from one perspective that the FIA seem to be altering, changing, modifying, Bob, the regulations to assist, well, all the teams, bar maybe the top two. What's your view?
It's got very, very complicated. Something has to be done, and it's very interesting that the teams are saying the FIA has to do it, rather than, well, actually the teams could do it themselves if they wanted to spare their drivers. And at one point you have Toto Wolff saying, yes, we have to look after our drivers, particularly when we saw Lewis getting out of the car after Azerbaijan. On the other hand, you have Franz Tost at the other end of the field, if you like, saying if they don't like it, they can go home and do something else, go gardening or something. So you have two entirely different feelings about the whole thing. And then on top of this, you have the business of Mercedes actually arriving in Montreal with extra stays for the floor. Now, how did they know about that? How did they know about the technical directive? And it's now suggested that a lady who used to work for Mercedes and now works for the FIA might have had some sort of what can we say, role in tipping off Mercedes. But that's all supposition, but it's all part of the if you like, the plot of what's going on. There was angry words spoken in some meeting at Montreal, and they're intending to have a hopefully quieter meeting again this week, later on in the week, and to discuss it. But something's got to be done, because it's not pleasant. It must be horrible for those guys. Even when we're riding on board with an onboard camera, we can just see their heads moving around. And when a driver literally cannot get out of the car or has difficulty getting out of the car and is absolutely wrecked at the end of a race, then you've got something has to be done. And if the team isn't going to do it because they lose performance by raising the ride height of the car, then the FIA has to step in, and unfortunately it has to affect everybody.
Yeah, makes sense. It's an interesting time. And if you're watching the GoF1 show for the first time and you think, gosh, I'd like to see some of the previous shows, the good news is you can. We have a YouTube channel which is performing as a library. We also take clips from this show, and that they are available there as well. You just search GoF1 show in YouTube, you'll find it. There's clips, for example, from a talk I did at the FCC in Hong Kong recently, where I got rather passionate about pants and piercings. We have exclusive interviews with drivers like Zhou Guanyu, who we've spoken about, Marcus Ericsson, the Indy 500 winner, India's Jahan Daruvala, who of course is, maybe not of course, but is driving a Formula One car for the first time tomorrow at Silverstone, driving a McLaren. So that's exciting news. We'll be catching up with him soon. But on to the next round of the World Championship. Now, of course, Canada, we understand from Formula One, had 338,000 fans going through the gates over the 3 days of the weekend. I understand the British Grand Prix is a sellout as well. Bob, two questions for you, first of all. Are you going to be working at the British Grand Prix? And then who's your prediction for the winner before we ask and we put on the spotlight on Alex for that question?
I am going to be working at the British Grand Prix. It's going to be a very busy weekend, because not only do we have Formula One, but we have Formula 2 and Formula 3, and we have the W Series, and we have Porsches. So everything, all the normal support races, it's going to be a very, very busy weekend. Hopefully it's going to be a dry weekend. That's what we really want. And who's going to be quick? Well, I'm absolutely certain that Max Verstappen will be on his A game there, and Ferrari will just be trying to him. I think it's going to be Red Bull Racing, Oracle Red Bull Racing, from just down the road, of course. They're only about 20 miles away, if that, the local team. But remember, it's part of a double header, and after that, immediately we go to Austria, another very quick circuit as well. Be very interesting, these next 4 races. I'm absolutely certain of it, these double headers. Alex, what do you think?
Good question. I agree. It's going to be Red Bull all the way. I think Silverstone is going to be a Red Bull fest. 1-2, probably the most dominant performance of the year, actually. They'll be untouchable there. Then we go to Austria. And beginning of the year, I would have said that's a Red Bull track as well. I changed my mind a bit. If Ferrari can find can get on top of the traction issues they had in Canada, if they can go back to how it was a bit earlier in the year, have good traction out those slow corners, I actually think Ferrari can do very well in Red Bull Ring, and win there.
Gosh, well, there we go. That would be fantastic. That'd be good for the championship. Another good reason for us all to stay tuned to this year's Formula One World Championship, and hopefully for you, ladies and gentlemen, to stay tuned to the GoF1. Nothing more for me to say other than please, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and perhaps give us a like. If you're doing it on other social media platforms such as Twitter, do the appropriate things there. And give a big thumbs up, if you would, to my guest today, to Bob Constanduros, to joining us from the UK. Many thanks to you, Bob, and of course, Alex Yoong in the hot seat in Kuala Lumpur.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Been great.
Thank you.
See you again soon. Thank you.